Hi everyone, we'll start in just a minute. We're just letting a few people come into the room. Fantastic. Welcome everyone to the next edition of Oxford Development Talks, the series that's trying to take the best of research in international development from Oxford and make it more widely available. I'm really pleased to be joined by our head of department at the Oxford Department of International Development, Professor Diego Sanchez-Ancochea. Diego is Professor of the Political Economy of Development. He's jointly appointed between the Department of International Development and the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. He's a fellow of St. Antony's College. And I think there are many fascinating things about your work, Diego, but some of the striking features are that you're an economist who works mainly with qualitative research methods and comparative case studies. And I think if there's a question that's underpinned your work, it's been how governments, particularly in Latin America, but potentially globally, can promote equality. What policies can they adopt? What kind of politics is necessary to promote equality? And what kind of institutions are needed to promote equality? And you've thought a lot about the role of labour markets within that, the role of social services and universal social provision. And Diego's written work that's focused on those areas can be read about, particularly in two co-authored monographs, two books, the first on good jobs and social services, co-authored with Juliana Martinez Franzoni, and another one with Cambridge University Press from a couple of years ago, The Quest for Universal Social Policy in the South. And Diego, you're going to speak about an issue of really contemporary importance, which is about the growing costs of inequality in Latin America and what they mean for the wider world. So Diego, I'll hand over to you to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll open up to Q&A. And if for those of you who are listening, you have a particular question you'd like to ask, please just type it into the chat box and we'll come to as many of your questions as we can. It's all yours, Diego.
Thank you very, very much. Alex, let me share this. Is it? Yes. So let me start by thanking Alex for the invitation, for the organization of this series of events, which I think are a fantastic way to showcase our work and to use the opportunity that we are all still in lockdown to have a conversation. Let me also thank everyone who has attended, particularly students. I know this is not a particularly easy moment for many of you, and it's fantastic to have you all, although I have to say it's less fantastic not to see you all and to have you in the other side of a screen. So what I want to do today is very much thinking about the cost of inequality, and I have to start by saying this will be primarily about economic or class inequality. I know there's many other dimensions that obviously we have in mind at the moment, racial inequality, ethnic inequality in the context of Latin America, and of course gender, all of which are related in many ways to income, and we might discuss later that links. But here I'm going to think about income inequality in particular, and I'm going to do it in the context very much of the growing problem in the OECD countries, not just in the Global South, in terms of income inequality. There you have the income share of the top 1%, so the richest 1% of the population in most of the OECD countries. And you can see that in all countries, that share is higher in 2015 than in 1980. And of course, in the US, that is particularly the case, but countries like United Kingdom or Poland are also doing particularly poorly. The US, as I was saying, it's a particularly negative place. There you have where the growth of the economy has gone to, and you can see that it went primarily to the 0.01% of the population. So while I talk, and I will talk, and many economists and political economists talk about income inequality in general, really this is very much about the concentration of income and opportunities at the very top. And as we think about the consequences of the pandemic, it's very clear that things are likely to get worse and not better. We, of course, don't have still a lot of academic work on the subject. We don't know, but all the articles, all the opinions concentrate on the possibility that this becomes even more of a challenge. So if for many of us, this was one of the challenges of the 21st century, clearly it will remain so. And it will remain so because, as you see, it's not only that inequality will intensify between, for example, highly educated workers and the rest, but it's also that after an initial moment in which the very rich were suffering, it seems clear that that is not the case now, and it will not be the case in the future. So the question is, if we are worried about this, or if we want to understand the consequences, we can do all kinds of econometric work, but we can also try to look at the experience of those countries and regions where the problem has been more significant and has been more significant for longest. And this is very much, obviously, the case of Latin America. So when you think about Gini coefficients, for example, which, as you remember, is the measure of inequality that goes from 0 to 1, 1 being most unequal, or in this case, from 0 to 100, you see that Latin America is significantly more unequal as a region than many others, and particularly almost 10, 11 percentage points more than Eastern Europe. It's not just that it's more unequal, but that it's a particular type of inequality. So Latin America is precisely characterized by very high levels of income at the top. Take the case of Chile, which according to most estimations, the 1% richest has 30% of all the income that is generated in the country. This is compared, for example, to 18% in the case of the US, which we already take as a country with very significant inequality. And this is obviously reflected in all dimensions of the region's life. So just to give you an example, in Mexico, the wealth of Carlos Slim, the owner of the telecom company, one of the richest men in the world. So the wealth of Slim is equivalent to 5% of the whole Mexican economy and could alone fund 4 times the country's education budget. So it just seems clear that this is a region that can tell us a lot about what might happen and what we should be worried about in thinking about other parts of the world. In that sense, this presentation is also an invitation to think about how parts of the global south can help inform discussions in the global north, and not the other way around, as we too often tend to do. So what are then the cost of inequality that in my broader work I discuss? Therefore, environmental, which I haven't done a lot of work with, but thanks to a course that we are convening in the MPhil and other mechanisms, I hope to think more about. But the other 3, which I have thought quite a bit about, which are how inequality leads to economic problems, including low growth, how it leads to social problems, including increasing issues like racism, like spatial segregation, and how it does lead to political problems. And I'm going to deal today with those political problems. Before I continue, I should make a warning, and also you'll forgive me, a small moment for publicity, which is much of what I'm going to discuss is based on a book that I just finished and will be published in December, The Cost of Inequality in Latin America, which is very much geared toward the general public. So much of what I'm going to do will get some of the Latin Americanists in the room, which I have seen there, are a little bit nervous because they are generalizations, but it's an invitation to think about the region in those general terms and general debates. So let me illustrate to you some of the problems of some of the political causes that I think inequality and especially concentration at the top has had in the political trajectories of the region. So very often we think about Latin America as a land of caudillos, as a land where there were just dictatorships historically, but as many people have shown, including my colleague Eduardo Posada, electoral competition has a long history in Latin America. So starting in Colombia in 1853 and then following to several other countries, much of the 19th century led to an expansion of voting rights, of course, just for men and just for men of a relatively significant levels of income. So that's why I prefer to call about limited democracy or about just electoral competition. That limited democracy was very much about the elite selecting their leaders, if you want, but with everyone else excluded. So for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Costa Rican Constitution talks about that the president had to be citizen by birth, secular, active, and the owner of property of value no less than 500 colones. And voters across the region also had limits in terms of who could vote. Nevertheless, electoral competition was intense, and voters actually and leaders have to search for votes. What were the consequences of this type of limited democracy? Well, much of the problem was that the system failed totally. Sorry, before I say that, why do I link limited democracy to inequality? Is because very much the elite across the period was very consistent in trying to shape the rules of the game of the democratic system, precisely to exclude as much as to include, because it was extremely worried about process of redistribution. And redistribution did not take place. We have systems in which social policy is geared only towards a small segment of the working class and the upper middle class. We have also systems in which things like working hours, minimum wages, and labor conditions were not regulated at all. We also have systems in which massive workers' demonstrations, when they occurred, were heavily prohibited and heavily persecuted by the police. So this system of limited democracy that slowly expand to new people, obviously eventually led to significant responses of the population in terms of dissatisfaction. And that leads to, if you want, the second element, the second part of the political system that is in this period, which is populism. So populism is, in my view, directly a response to the limits of democracy and the elite nature of democracy. Is, if you want, a response of the working class and to the inability of the system to incorporate, and therefore to pressure for a political incorporation. As you know, Latin America is there in the 1930s all the way to the 1970s, characterized by different episodes of populism. And I know it's a complicated word. I know Jill Hedges, which is, I think in the audience, reminds me always very careful to use, but here I'm referring to in the sense of leaders that try to connect directly to the electorate, put reality very much in black and white, and talk a lot about protecting people from the oligarchy. We have the best known cases as Perón in Argentina or Vargas in Brazil, but of course we also have others. And let me here tell you a little bit about another example, which is less well known for those of you that are not Latin Americanists, which is the case of Jose Maria Velasco Ibarra in Ecuador. So he was president 5 different times, that in the space of 38 years, and he tried to build the type of political connection that you would imagine in this type of politics. So he argues, he said, give me a balcony and I will become president. He was initially elected with 80% of the vote and moved to actually do the type of contradictory reforms that characterized populism during the whole period. What are these contradictory? On the one hand, it expanded labor rights, it expanded social policy, and it tried to increase representation from different parts of the urban working class. But on the other hand, it didn't have a lot of interest in strengthening democracy and democratic institutions. For example, he detained opposition leaders without any real justification in the 1930s and abolished the constitutions of 1935, of 1946, and 1970. Why do I say that populism is a cause of inequality in Latin America? It's precisely because of this contradictory feature. It clearly responds to demands created by very high inequalities between different groups, but at the same time, it creates and perpetuates instability, especially in terms of institutions and in terms of the rules of the game. It also led sometimes to actually an even more violent response from the elite. And this is the last phase that I think it's important to consider. Paul Drake, a well-known political scientist that has written a very influential book on democracy in the regions, summarized what I think is very nicely the problem. The elites in Latin America, and I'm quoting, scramble to co-opt or crush these movements. When the well-to-go to fear that popular democracy jeopardize upper and middle class privileges, they impose protected democracies or exclusionary authoritarianism. Some resorted to unusually barbaric dictatorships by the armed forces. This is the case, obviously, of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile that are in the 1970s. And this clear and continuous struggle between an elite refusing to create political space and a political system trying to expand those political spaces without strengthening formal democracy characterized a region for the whole 20th century. So between 1950 and 1990, for example, Latin America was responsible for 44 of the 97 political regimes changes in the whole world, so almost 50%. It's important to emphasize that this inequality-induced shift in systems is in many ways characteristics of the new wave of democracy that starts in Latin America in the 1878, 1880. So during this period, between 1978 and 2000, almost every Latin American country, with the exception of Cuba, moves towards formal democracy and establishes elections, establish independent political parties, independent institutions, etc. And however, it was another type of limited democracy, if you want. Of course, this time it was not limited in the terms of people not being able to vote, both men and women, but in terms of the institutional structure that was created. So the limits created by the neoliberal rules of the game, plus the creation of institutions like central banks that were very oriented towards protecting those policies, or political systems, very clear in the case of Pinochet, Pinochet's democratic transition, in which some of the institutions were constraints in terms of representation, means that democracy didn't deliver, even in this phase, nearly as much as it should. That, together with an economic crisis in the late 1990s, meant that people lost faith in democracy once again. So Latin Americans actually, between 1995 and 2001, the support for democracy in the region decreased by 11 percentage points. By the latest year, support for democracy was only around 40% of all Latin Americans. And this led to a new wave of populism, which in many ways had all the strengths, but the same weaknesses than some of the previous waves. What were the strengths? There was a significant expansion of social policy. There was a significant expansion of workers' rights, including an effort to formalize the economy. But at the same time, there were significant constraints on democratic institutions. These had to do with limits on think tanks, limits when opposition political parties, etc. And this permanent tension that we see in environments of high inequality between the expansion of economic rights versus a much lower expansion of political rights. Why do I think these are relevant? Sorry, before I do that, and because I tell you how it's relevant, I think what is most problematic and what the region teaches us that we shouldn't forget is that the vicious circle is not just that high inequality leads to these problems of institutions, but also that these kinds of institutions in terms perpetuate inequality over the long run. And in my broader work, I try to show these vicious circles in the social sphere, in the economic sphere, but here let me illustrate what I mean by that through the political sphere. So here you have in this graph how limited democracy in itself leads to elite capture, and this is by control of electoral processes, by the electoral rules, by buying elections if you want, etc., and by weakening political parties, which in terms leads to further inequality in terms of the policies that are adopted. Populism, as I said, does allow for more of redistributed policies, but I would argue, and we can discuss, over the medium and long run, by creating and enhancing economic instability and also political instability, these politics of you are against me or for me actually end up increasing or perpetuating inequality at the same time. The case of dictatorships are even clearer. Sorry, I didn't translate the word, and it's in Spanish. And let me just give you one source of information that I think illustrates this very clearly. Between 1973 and 1987, in Pinochet Chile, the income percentage, the income share of the top 10%, of the richest 10%, increased from 34% to 52%. So that's 18 percentage points. If you want, this is what we could call an anti-Robin Hood in steroids. So I think what is interesting is that in some ways, I think that same type of politics, of course, with a lot of differences because of the nature of institutions in different countries, because of the less likelihood of a military overthrow, etc., are increasingly evident in other parts of the world. And you have there the case of Viktor Orban and Donald Trump in Hungary and the US. I would argue that growing discontent with democracy that is very evident in all across the world, from France to the US, Hungary, etc., is part of what led to the populist experiments. And that very much was a growing discontent with democracy that was unable to give policy and political responses and diversity to the increasing challenges of globalization and increasing inequality. But of course, this was a populist of different kinds. If you want, and again, we can discuss, I would argue that this was a populism, and this is a populism that has all the bad features of Latin America, particularly in terms of the lack of respect for democracy, but with none of the good ones. There's very little redistribution. Think about Trump's main policy reform was an reduction in taxation for the rich. And also it's a politics of new enemies, which tend to actually be people with weak positions in society to start with. And the question that I will throw to all of you based on the Latin American experience is what can happen in the long run if we have that type of politics. If democracy is not working because it's in the hands of the elite, as if it was in Latin America, but populism is the one in which we weaken democracy even more without expanding redistribution. And I think the Latin American experience gives us warnings in that area. Of course, I don't want to stop here because actually I think what is interesting about Latin America is that with all its problems, with all of inequality, it also has positive lessons. And I want to emphasize that because even in this area, Anglo-Saxon policymakers, Anglo-Saxon politicians, and I fear sometimes academics, tend to think that the US and the UK are the center of the world. Let me just give you a quote here from one of the key collaborators of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Last year, he says, it makes sense that the two countries that fell to neoliberalism first may be the farthest along in organizing resistance to it. Any Latin Americanist in the room, but obviously any person working in the Global South, will see immediately how ridiculous that quote actually is, because in many parts of the Global South, organization against neoliberalism, against inequality, has a much longer tradition. In the book, I argue that Latin America can teach us in the areas of ideas, in the areas of movements, and in the ideas of policies. But here, because I want to actually open as quickly as possible for questions and conversation, I want to focus exclusively on the element of movements. And here I'm thinking about the long tradition of movements in Latin America that go from the Zapatistas in Mexico to the MAS, the movement for socialism in Bolivia, but also go to the students' movement in Chile or the Landless movement in Brazil. I think what we see here is the importance of movements precisely because of the existence of some democratic spaces, more than in other parts of the world, even if with the weaknesses that I have described before, in the presence of very high inequality and weak political systems. And I think, obviously, we could be here talking for a long time about social movements in the region, but I think they teach us 4 elements that are important and that many other movements in the rest of the world would do well to think about. The first is the effective link between specific demands and ambitious national projects. So this is, for example, the case of the student movement in Chile, which started by very specific demands from students. That was, for example, lower transportation costs or quickly delivery of the student ID, but very soon were also framed as well into national discussions about education and around the economic model. They have in general, with exceptions of course, been movements that have tried to democratize spaces and avoid the strong leaders. The Landless movement makes a huge effort to actually minimize the personalistic leaders and expand, for example, women leadership. They have been extremely creative in the way they frame issues and they frame messages. They were having at the forefront of using social media, but also of creating new understandings of the law, for example, as is the case of the Landless movement. And they have also tried to link with political parties. Many of them have done and have a communication with parties of the left, but at the same time, always making sure that they maintain, protect their autonomy. Let me illustrate with a movement that some of you, so our own Laura Rival and others have done more work on, but that I think is extremely interesting to show some of these elements. This is the Landless movement, the Movimiento de los Trabajadores Rurales en Terra. So founded in 1984, it's actually one of the largest movements in the world, the largest in Latin America with 1.5 million members. It emerged very much around the conflict over land distribution and over occupations. So to tell you a quote from one of their activists, the camp, so the occupations, is the movement's struggle through occupying people's break away from cultural norms, society and tradition, and come together in the fight for land. So it's very much about responding to a very specific need of very significant segments of the agricultural population in Brazil. But it goes much farther than that. It has thought about how to actually deliver an agriculture sector that is much more sustainable environmentally and also much more socially sustainable as well. And it increasingly has actually participated in national struggles. It builds on the very creative understanding of how to frame legal debates. So occupations are actually illegal, depending on how you read the Brazilian constitution, but actually it's a gray line in terms of being allowed to occupy lands that are not being used. And they have been very creatively working with lawyers to put those things on the table. They have finally linked actions with ideas. They have their own university. They are trying to put a lot of emphasis in education, etc. And again, I think it's a long tradition of mobilization in Latin America that gives us a lot of clues about how we can think on other places and other traditions where, and I'm thinking about parts of the global north, where more traditional politics, including politics around trade unions, have dominated much more. Of course, some of you might say, well, there's a contradiction between the first part of Diego's talk and the second. It would not be the first one for those of you that know me that I would be contradicting myself. But I don't think the contradiction is as significant. In fact, what Latin America shows is that in spaces of inequality, you will tend to have very significant protests and more creative protests than in other parts. But at the same time, that when you are in the presence of very long-term inequality, you will have vicious circles and structural constraints that will make the erosion of inequality harder and harder. And I would argue that this is why countries like the UK, countries like the US, and increasingly much of Europe should worry and should remember that the window of opportunity to fight inequality for good might be narrowing and narrowing as we move along. Thank you very much.
Diego, thank you very much. That was a brilliant way to set things up. And you posed a series of fascinating questions about the relationship between inequality, populism, and also resistance. We've got a number of questions coming in, but I'm just going to begin with a question, if I may. In thinking about the relationship between inequality and populism, one of the mechanisms you use to explain why inequality has historically contributed to populism is elite capture. And I suppose when I think about the rise of populism in Europe, I look to some countries in Central Europe, like Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and they have rising populism, but very low Gini coefficients. And that leads to sort of two follow-up questions. First of all, what's the relationship between the ideational and the material? So you started with a lot of your analysis focusing on the material aspects of inequality driving populism, but then you briefly touched upon the idea of new scapegoats like migrants, the social construction of difference and inequality. So what account do you make for the role of ideational aspects of inequality, potentially inequality that's not just income inequality, but maybe around identity or geography? And second, following from that, what does that mean for our measure of inequality? So you started with income inequality, you started with Gini coefficients, but do we actually need to broaden how we measure and understand inequality to account for ideas, differences in identity, differences in geography, as well as income, to capture what's going on in the relationship today between inequality and populism? So I know those are two big questions, but perhaps give any thoughts just to get us started.
I think that's a fantastic set of questions. Thank you, Alex, so much. There's my own limitations. I do think that traditional political economists tend to look at the world too much in terms of actual resources and not enough in terms of ideas. And I think there's no doubt that initially in Latin America, and even now more in Europe and the US, this is about inequalities, not just in income, but in, as you were saying, recognition, right? And the word recognition is very important, that segments of the lower middle class have seen not just resources diminished, but also the respect, the place they occupy in society also weaken very significantly. That translates, I think, in the history of Latin America to very significant parts of the middle class simply not having a political space ideationally and not just in terms of resources. The second is that I think one key element that you mentioned as well is that even in context of relatively low inequality, increases in inequality might be more significant, right? As people see that, yes, they are still better than others, but the gains from process of globalization, transformation, opening in the case of Eastern Europe are benefiting them less than others in society. And I think that their elites are important. But the third is a recognition that we need to do much more work precisely around the different dimensions of inequality that go around recognition, around identity rates, etc., and of course, maintaining income and maintaining the issue of income at the top as well.
Fantastic. So we've got a question from Rogelio Madreño, who says, if we assume that COVID-19 crisis reinforces inequalities, it could also be foreseen that Latin American countries would eventually become the epicenter of the pandemic and its consequences, as is happening right now. Is the region's, if the region's aim is to, the region is moving towards suffering greater costs socially, politically, and institutionally, sorry, is the region moving towards suffering greater costs socially, politically, and institutionally? And what should international and regional institutions do to cope with these broader inequalities in the context of COVID-19 in Latin America?
So first, there's no doubt that Latin America has become the epicenter of the pandemic, and that this has been in both countries that have responded politically in terms of policy very poorly, Brazil, Mexico, but also countries that initially responded very well, like Peru, but still were limited by these structures of inequality, poor social services, etc. Those of you that attended a panel that we organized a few weeks back precisely on this issue, I think demonstrated how we can think about this from a pessimistic and from an optimistic perspective. From a pessimistic, there's no doubt that the combination of the health and economic crisis in the context of relatively high debt in the region will have very negative elements. In a positive, I think, and this goes also to some of the ideational elements, although in a different way, Alex, that you were mentioning, I think we have an opportunity to frame debates very differently. And I think, as I was saying, some social movements in Latin America will have the potential to frame the crisis as an opportunity. If you want to ask my opinion, I always tend to be more on the pessimistic side, but I'm always trying to learn from people like you, Alex, and others to be optimistic. And therefore, I think that window of opportunity becomes extremely important to think about and to see how we can maximize it.
Fantastic. There's a question from Barbara Harris-White. She says, thank you, Diego, for arguments which we can relate to the UK as well as other parts of the world. You use populism to cover quite a wide range of politics. What distinguishes populism from fascism, and why is the F word not used? To what extent is populism fascism with Latin American characteristics?
So I think that's a fantastic question, and one that I was saying, for example, a colleague of mine, Jill, and I debate all the time. I think, so why do I think the term is important to start with? Because I do think, for a couple of reasons. First, I think political scientists, and those that are in the room will correct me, have shown that there's a certain type of doing politics, which are about trying to link directly to the electorate, that are about trying to look very much for scapegoats, etc., that are about questioning the system that might be very similar in different parts of the world. At the same time, I think it's extremely important to separate between those populists that want to redistribute income opportunities and those that they want. Maybe one we should call populist and the other fascist, but I just wanted to emphasize that contradictory nature of the Latin American element, while there's very little contradiction in the European one, etc. It's a lose-lose situation. So for me, that type of contrasting might be useful, but I think it obviously has already led to a lot of discussions and discussions that we should continue in the future.
There's a question from Albert Rodriguez who says, what do you think of the case of El Salvador? Is there something in particular that can be done to reduce inequality in this small country? And perhaps if you feel able to, Diego, you could sort of say something about some of the particular characteristics of El Salvador for people not familiar with some of the history. Because it's a case, I suppose, that seems to fit the cycle you outline of neoliberalism followed by backlash, followed by resistance over a historical cycle.
Absolutely. So El Salvador, exactly in one of the small countries in Central America, has historically struggled with elite-driven politics without much of the limited democracy I was saying, other than in a specific episodes, but very much an elite-dominated politics for much of its history. After democratization, as Alex was saying, it leads to neoliberalism and then to a move to the left. And I think it's interesting for that, but it's also interesting because it shows how skeptical we should be about the statistics, by the way. So according to some statistics, in El Salvador is today less unequal than Costa Rica, something that is actually very hard to believe when you think about those two countries. And that's because we don't have very good statistics about inequality at the top. What do I think, how to think about inequality in a country like that? I think the first thing is we need to strengthen the state. And for example, I worry that the current president, which is very much consolidating populist politics, the populist way of doing politics is actually weakening the state and not strengthening. I think we need to weaken and democratize the state. And then we need to gradually and slowly try to move to create better jobs, but also more universal social policies, doing it step by step. And there, if I had more time, the work that I have done with Juliana Martinez, that Alex was making reference to, highlights a lot that there's some ways to try to take steps gradually but steadily to try to build universal policies over the long run. Actually, the previous government did a few of that, but was totally unable to create a more dynamic economy and therefore better jobs.
Jonathan Madison asks about that historical longue durée and the long period of history by saying, do you feel that the cycle of authoritarianism and populism is becoming more contained within democratic institutions as a result of the third wave of democracy and democratization? And one might add to that subsequent waves of revolution around the world that have tried to bring democratization. Is that cycle we read about in histories of Latin America over, or is it continuing, or has it changed form?
So I don't know, and I hope it was over, but I think this is one time where we have to remember that we talk about short periods and it was long history. So in Latin America, we had dictatorships just 40, 50 years ago all the time. In Latin America, even in the 20th and 21st century, we have had attempts of coup, or we have had coups. In my view, something like what happened in Honduras and Paraguay were very much coups. In Brazil today, there's a struggle which could question democracy altogether. So I guess instead of answering, and without wanting to sound too pessimistic, I think we have to remember that there's really no reason why episodes of authoritarian returns could not come, actually not just to Latin America, but to other parts of the world. By now, we should know that the end of history was actually not an end at all, but a continuation of continuous struggles.
Right. And there's a question from Francis Stewart who says, I don't think you can discuss these issues without considering race. It's no accident that the worst inequalities in the world are those where a historic, open brackets, white, close brackets, elite are trying to preserve their privilege, such as South Africa, as well as Latin American countries. The white working class is ready to go along with this for identity reasons. And I suppose I could add to that, I suppose from your talk, when you referred to the UK, the United States, a lot of what's going on in Europe with scapegoating, what seems to be changing is not necessarily just income inequality, but the racialization of politics. So I wonder how you think about race in relation to your analysis.
So absolutely, absolutely, but with a caveat in a second. So absolutely, in the sense that, and I try when I discuss the social cost of inequality very much to explore the relationship between racism and income inequality. There's no doubt that the elites have consistently used the issue of race to separate different segments of the middle class and stop any attempt to create interclass alliances in Latin America. This is very clear, for example, in countries like Guatemala, where the elite, after the peace accords, used the threat of ethnicity and ethnicity majority to scare other segments of the population. So I have no doubt that combination between race and income is particularly pernicious. I have no doubt that that's also the case in the US, and probably, although I actually, funny enough, know less about the UK. I think what is interesting in Latin America, however, is that there's something that means that even countries with relatively small indigenous and Black populations, like Argentina, like Uruguay, like Costa Rica, are at the top of inequality, even in the global basis. So there's something else. So I would say clearly the relationship between race and inequality makes things particularly negative, but clearly there's a history of elite-driven politics in Latin America that is a warning even for countries where the race issue might be, and racism may be less of a problem.
Lydia Lozano asks, given the formidable and enduring obstacles to greater equality in Latin America, which you stress, how do you explain the significant reduction in inequality which occurred across much of the region, particularly between 2003 and 2011? What drove this process, for instance, policies, social movements, or shift in the global economy, e.g. the commodity boom?
That's a fantastic question, Lydia, and one when I said that Latin America teaches about ideas, movements, and policies, when that part of the policies where I discuss is precisely the 2000s. Let me say two things. The first is that as far as we know, the 2000s, and again, we need much more evidence, were a period in which there was significant redistribution from the upper middle class to the low-income groups, but very little redistribution from the significant elite. So when in countries where we have data that includes taxation, so a la Piketty, we know that, like the case of Chile, like the case of Brazil, we actually have that the share of income from the top income groups, particularly the 1% and the 0.1%, did not decrease. They maintained it. So that elite-driven part of the economy did not change a lot. What the countries that did better was redistribute from parts of the workers to other parts of workers. And I think their democratization was extremely important, together with the commodity boom and to the expansion of ideas around universalism, universal social policy, not only in Latin America, but in other parts of the world. My hope, our hope, when Juliana and I think about it, is that there would be a second phase in which new social policies demanded more taxation, and that started eroding the role of the elite. Sadly, I think the problem is the pandemic came and the economic crisis came, and this might or might not be possible in the future.
Great. Juliana Utes from Argentina, she says, asks, why do you think Latin America is rather absent from the worldwide debate around inequality? She observes that the current debate is very focused on the US, the UK, the rest of Europe, and that's reflected in a lot of the contemporary literature by Piketty and others. One would imagine from your analysis, she says, that Latin America should be a central part of the debate and we should be learning from the region. So why are we not discussing it in the sort of wider, not only scholarly literature, but public debate?
I think that's a fantastic question. and again, it's partly a joke, but my first answer would be, I thought that it stops by people reading my book, but I am afraid I am a very low-key academic, so that will never happen. But more seriously, I wrote the book precisely because of this. I think one of the reasons is the quote I read, which is that parts even of progressive movements in the global north are very focused on the global north. Part of the reason has to do, and I think this is actually an invitation for our own department, and I don't know what Alex and others think, but in my view, to start thinking about what it means global north and global south. And I know that's something like Francis Stewart, Nikita, many others are thinking about, in the sense that we sometimes think that the global north cannot learn from the experiences of the global south. I think as soon as we break those barriers, we will understand that that's the case. And that is not enough with saying, oh, these countries had weaker institutions, so we cannot learn. We need to do much more of those comparisons. And then the third one has to do with timing. The US and Europe have become unequal just now in the last 20, 30 years, while Latin America was for much longer. And there's like a gap in thinking together about those issues. But I hope we change, and I surely think that we have a lot to teach about the good and bad of Latin America to the rest of the world.
I think that that's a really inspiring observation to say, well, actually, if we're going to have equality of exposure of how we think about different regions, we actually need to rethink binaries like North and South, and the power relations that place particular emphasis on scholarship that's about or to do with or from particular regions. And I suppose if there's an advantage potentially to the current moment, it creates a huge awareness of the weaknesses in Western societies and the fact that we all have a lot to learn from one another on a global comparative basis. We're almost out of time, and we've gone through most of the questions from the audience. But I suppose just in terms of a final word from you, Diego, if you were to sort of put together one sort of key message of what you would suggest not only to elected politicians, policymakers, but also a wider public, what would you want to tell them about the ways in which we can best confront populism based on your own research and the inspiration we can take from looking at Latin America? What's the key, or what are the key insights you would want people to understand most clearly?
So that's a great question. Let me say a few. The first, let me say three. Let me see if I can summarize them in three. The first is, we keep talking about inequality as sometimes as diversity between different income groups. I think it's very important, and the 99 movement, etc., emphasizes that inequality at the top, that concentration at the very top, and the politics that creates is a significant problem. Second, and therefore, that we need to find ways to create interclass coalitions between very significant parts of the middle class and the working class that are being affected by volatility, vulnerability, etc. And the more that we are able to build discourses and design policies that cover significant parts of the population, the more we will be able to overcome the discourse of populists, etc. And the third one, and maybe it's not to policymakers, is that this is a very long and difficult process. Contrary to other solutions, inequality will not be resolved very soon. So it's very much about the continuing effort, and it's very much about designing policies that don't resolve problems today, but that also create a whole set of political processes of path dependence that actually strengthens actors that might demand for even more redistribution. So how we think about the short term but the long term at the same time, I think it's a big challenge for policymakers and for academics, but that one that we need to meet more significantly than we are doing it now.
Fantastic. And there is just one question that's come in. So I'm going to offer you that last question. And it's really about, I suppose, the political economy of knowledge. It's from an anonymous attendee who I suppose is suggesting that in general, economic analysis tends to result in certain types of recommendation to reduce inequalities, which are then put to politicians and policymakers. However, as is the case in Latin America, there's a lot of gender inequality at the social level in terms of equal participation in politics. There's a lot of racial division. Indigenous women in particular often have very little voice. So the attendee is asking what specifically can be done to reduce inequality if the political system and the elites tend to listen to knowledge and guidance that comes from particular sources, for example, academics who are mostly themselves white, male, or elite. And I recognize that's a very challenging question to end with, because it's to do with how social inequality, particularly around identity, relates to the way in which knowledge and the kind of ideas you're offering relates to the political elite classes and the potential for change. So I wonder if you've got any final thoughts on that last question.
Yeah, so let me, instead of answering it at a very theoretical or analytical level, to try to answer in terms of the experience, my own experiences, but I think the experiences of a department like ours. I think what it was suggested is a significant call for us as an academics, and even more in a place like Oxford, to engage as equals with knowledges and with researchers from across the global South. Recognizing those knowledges, recognizing those political activisms, and trying to work as equals. I by no means have succeeded. Most of my networks are probably from upper middle class or middle class in Latin America, but clearly I attempt to engage with them and with other segments in society in as equal ways as possible. So this is clearly my work with Juliana Martinez, which is she's very much rooted in Latin America, one of the best researchers on gender inequalities and social policy in the region, and one in which I just try to learn from all the time. I think also it's our obligation to create a space for other groups. This is done, for example, in associations like the Latin American Studies Association, but I hope it's also done, not as well as it could, and there's a lot to do in places like our department in Oxford.
I think that's a terrific final message from you, not only as a scholar and an academic, but also as our head of department in Oxford. And I think it's something that certainly I and many colleagues would widely endorse as the right and appropriate vision for how we do international development scholarship. Thank you, Diego. This has been a wonderful talk. You've engaged really amazingly well with all of the wide-ranging questions that have been put to you. And I think for people like me who are not experts on Latin America, this has been really accessible, but also you've engaged your research in a global conversation and given us a lot of food for thought about how we can collectively think about and confront the relationship between inequality and populism. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the generosity of sharing your ideas and your thoughts. And we all look forward to reading your forthcoming book. And thank you everyone at home for joining us. And thank you to Joe Boyce for doing the communications and supporting this conversation. So join us again next time for another Oxford Development Talks. And in the meantime, stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much, Alex.